So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sharon Whiteman, and I work with the team at the Lyme Disease Association of Australia, and we're committed to making a difference for current and future Australians sick from Lyme and associated diseases. And for May 2023, we're running a series of interviews again for education and support and uplifting. And today we're very privileged to have Dr. Rosalie Greenberg. She's a board-certified adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist known for her expertise in the diagnosis and management of complex psychiatric problems in children and pediatric psychopharmacology. Dr. Greenberg received her MD from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, where she also completed her training in adult psychiatry, as well as a fellowship in child psychiatry, serving as chief resident. She subsequently served for years on the teaching faculty at Columbia. A firm believer in the power of education, Dr. Greenberg is an author, researcher, lecturer, co-producer of an educational film, and creator and host of an award-winning cable TV show, all related to children's health. These various activities have been geared to both medical professionals and the lay public, including presentations at both national and international conferences. Dr. Greenberg brings 40 years of experience to topics that range from adolescent suicide, pediatric bipolar disorder, as well as the many psychological aspects attributed to Lyme disease. Working in New Jersey, where Lyme disease is endemic, she found a sizable number of the children she evaluated tested positive for tick-borne illness, most of who've never known a tick bite. For the past few years, she has focused on the psychiatric manifestations of infectious diseases, especially tick-borne illnesses in children and adolescents. So, Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for immediately saying yes to help us out here in Australia.
Well, thank you for asking me. Thank you for inviting me.
And so we had a brief chat before. I know you're pretty shocked about the situation in Australia. But before we get into our specific issues, tell us a bit how you got, attracted, how you've become an expert in adolescent and child, especially Lyme kids.
Well, I always like to say I didn't go looking for the ticks found me. Okay. Because when I trained at Columbia, it was the beginning of the biologic age in psychiatry. So I was very interested in, the biologic mechanisms in psychiatric illness. And I also trained with people who are pioneers in putting pediatric depression on the map. So initially I specialized in pediatric mood disorders, especially pediatric bipolar disorders. Well, I had one kid that was very ill. He had been hospitalized psychiatrically, diagnosed as bipolar 3 times within 1 year. He was around 11. And he was very hard to stabilize. Although I had him, he was discharged to me and I took care of him for a few months. He was okay. But then he started having difficulties again. And I tried to think, well, he's going into residential placement unless I can come up with some miracle here. So I had just heard a lecture by Sue Sweeto at the National Institute of Mental Health on PANS and PANDAS. And I don't know how familiar your audience might be with those illnesses, but they're basically pediatric illnesses that are felt to occur after certain infections, especially strep, and results in autoimmune reactions that can result in neuropsychiatric symptoms. Okay, well, anyway, so I got strep testing as well as some other things on this kid. And his mother said he never had a strep test. He never had a strep infections. His sisters did, but he never did. And his titer was like 800. Normal is 0 to 200. Well, he sure did have one at some point. And I worked with a doctor who was treating PANS and PANDAS. And it took around 3 months, and he had to add another antibiotic. But suddenly this kid came in and said, "Oh, hi, Dr. Greenberg. Yeah, I decided I want to get A's in school." Huh?
I goosebumps.
I want to get A's in school. I mean, he's leaning on his mother, just being affectionate. And I'm thinking, who am I talking to? I've never seen this in my entire career. Okay, so I start looking at infections in my bipolar kids. because I'm an expert in that. So that's what most of my practice winds up being. If you're not an expert, you become one once people think you are. So I started getting a lot of testing for infections on my new patients. And one of the tests that you get is Mycoplasma pneumoniae. It's a bacterial infection, which is not uncommon, causes walking pneumonia. But I found that more of my kids were positive for Mycoplasma than they were for strep. And then I learned that Mycoplasma is also carried by ticks. Okay, let's look at the ticks, see what we can learn there. And I followed that road and I've never come back because, once I learned about tick-borne testing and the potholes or whatever, the problems involved, and different ways you have to look at things, it was amazing. And what I found is that the majority of my bipolar kids, the new kids that were coming to me, were positive for tick-borne illnesses. Well, there are kids I've been treating since they were 4 years old for bipolar disorder. They're in their late teens. Well, it's not there. If I look for those in my newer patients, I should go back and look for that in the kids I've been treating for years. And to my surprise, the majority of them were also positive for tick-borne disorders.
Wow.
Which then really confused me because then what is pediatric bipolar? And I think it's a much more complicated question than just saying infection, but it's infection related in a certain proportion of kids without question. And look, finding serological evidence of tick-borne illness doesn't mean that person has the diagnosis. But I would send the kids to clinicians who are specialists in tick-borne disorders, so what we call Lyme literate physicians. And the majority would say, yes, he's got it. Okay. But, you still can't get too excited. I mean, these are kids that are hard to treat. But then they get treated for their tick-borne illnesses in addition to the psychiatric treatment. And again, I saw more things that I hadn't seen before. One young man who I treated for years, he came in, he was around 17. This was after he was treated for the tick-borne illness. Once I went backwards and found it in him. And he said, everybody had racing thoughts. You mean that's not normal? And in manic illness, everything's at a heightened level, high energy, high level of thinking, you're impulsive, you're going fast. But the rapid thoughts with him didn't stop with my slow down with the antibiotics he was getting. This was all that because I mean, your mother or father do whatever to you. That's not creating what I see. It couldn't be. And to realize that, well, an infection or an autoimmune reaction can come into play as symptoms.
You dropped out, Dr. Greenberg.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. But my point is that I had to rethink the way I think in psychiatry. Because you have to know that my bipolar kids, I believe that genetics are a very important part of the different illnesses we have. Things run in families. All of my kids had genetics going along. There was somebody in each family that had bipolar disorder, unless the child was adopted. And there I didn't have the family history. Although many who give their kids up for adoption are bipolar because they're involved with substance abuse or they're too impulsive or whatever. So this required a greater reorganization in my thinking, and how to just approach these kids. Now, it's not that you treat their tick-borne illness and then all the psychiatric symptoms are going to go away. But the majority of the kids, at least the kids I see, that's not true. But I figured there are like 3 different groups. One, that you treat the tick-borne illness, but you're also using psychiatric meds during that time because they may be highly aggressive or suicidal or homicidal or severe OCD. They're tortured and the families are tortured. So you do need to use some psychiatric medicines to help get things under control. But for some of the kids, once they get treatment for the various tick-borne illnesses, they may not need to be on psychiatric medicines at all. I mean, I have one case in the literature that I wrote up with Dr. Ed Breitschwert and colleagues, and he's an expert in Bartonella. And this was this boy with a 14 sudden onset of hallucinations, delusions. He thought the cat was trying to kill him. Mm-hmm. He winds up with 3 hospitalizations over the course of a year. At least 2 psychiatrists give him the diagnosis of schizophrenia. But then one day somebody noticed the stretch marks, the stria on him. Mm. And they said, oh, he should be tested for Bartonella. And Dad got in touch with Dr. Breitschwert, and what do you know? This kid who was treatment resistant to multiple antibiotics and psychiatric meds did great and actually was able to get off all the psychiatric meds once he was properly treated for the Bartonella. Wow. And then a while later, he was able to be, taken off the Bartonella meds. He went on to graduate high school, did extremely well. He was an A+ student anyway, but not when he was sick, and just completed his 3rd year of college, I think, or as close to it. Wow. I mean, that's an amazing story. Mm. He was going to be schizophrenic in everybody's eyes, and he wasn't. Mm. And he wasn't. And so then there's another group that, again, they may have psychiatric symptoms, and you need to treat them with some psychiatric meds. But you treat them with the proper treatments for the bugs, so to speak, and they get better. And they may need less medicine, psychiatric medicine, as they get better, but they're still going to need some psychiatric medicine. And then you have another group of kids that are they're really struggling. They present with major psychiatric problems. Often they have multiple tick-borne disorders, and they're going to need both. And they, even after tick-borne infections are taken care of, they're still going to need some psychiatric medicines. But I mean, it was amazing to me. Mm. And the more I looked at this, the more I believe that for children and adolescents, neurocognitive and neurobehavioral, neuropsychiatric symptoms are probably the most common symptom for presentation, other than headaches. Headaches supposedly occur in 70% of the kids with Lyme. But a study was done by Anita Bellman at Stony Brook, a hospital in New York, and she looked at 96 kids that presented to a pediatric Lyme clinic. Okay, and the most common symptom was headaches in 71%. The next most common symptom was facial palsy, Bell's palsy, in only 14%. But as you go through her data, you find that what she really found was also 40% of the kids had problems with anxiety, attentional issues. They were depressed. and, had problems. They looked like ADD. So, I mean, I think we need good studies to be able to show that. But I really believe that neuropsychiatric symptoms are often the presentation of Lyme disease in kids.
Wow.
Chronic Lyme disease. I'm not talking about acute Lyme disease. You can see some, neurocognitive symptoms early on, but usually that's a later symptom. And you have to think about this. Kids are a work in progress. So they're developing. So, at 6 years old, you think he's a genius. And by 10, well, maybe he's not such a genius, But that could also be that things have interfered, such as these infections. And the rule of tick-borne infections, if you have one, you probably have 2 or 3 or more, be it Bartonella, Babesia. And these affect different people differently. Mm-hmm. And that's part of why it's very hard to treat them. It has been amazing. Every psychiatric symptom that you can list, I would say I have seen in a youngster with tick-borne illness, which is amazing and scary. Because how many of our kids that have chronic psychiatric illnesses may also be suffering from underlying infections?
Yeah.
Are going unnoticed.
I think that's in a lot of areas of medicine, isn't it, Dr. Greenberg? Like if you look at rheumatology or neurology, they don't look for stealth infections. They're, as a root cause.
Well, to some degree, I think, yes, that is true. Medicine at this point has not totally embraced that infections are the cause of many illnesses. And yet, we live in a world, and I assume it's the same in Australia as it is in the United States, where the buzzword is inflammation. Inflammation causes heart disease. Inflammation is associated with neurologic disease. Inflammation is a problem with just about everything under the sun. Well, guys, what causes inflammation? Well, one thing is infections. But people don't think about that. They don't necessarily take those steps backward. And I think also people wind up working in silos. They see what I don't know again how it is in Australia, but I know here, that's not my field. I don't know it, and if you work with these kids, you have to be aware of the issue of cardiac problems, GI issues. I mean, there are a variety of different systems that get affected. And so you need a team. My experience is one person often is not enough. It's like this puzzle that a lot of people have different pieces of. Well, you put them all together and maybe you've got a solution, but nobody's putting it all together. And you have to go to each one to get that next piece. And often I find my patients will be treated by somebody for a year or 2, and then they plateau. And if they're not better, then it's time to go see someone else who has a different approach. And I'm not against using herbs or any of these things. To me, whatever works is the right answer. And that's how I look at it. We have to be aware that we don't know everything. But I think one has to create an interdisciplinary team for oneself if you're going to work with these kids. I mean, I have a neurologist that I work closely with, the cardiologist that I work closely with, and you need this. You need people who are going to speak the same language and trust you, and are willing to think out of the box. It's syphilis was called the great imitator because Sir William Osler said something like, he who knows syphilis understands all of medicine. Well, tick-borne illness has been called, especially Lyme, has been called the new great imitator because it can create just about every single symptom you can think of. It took years, a few hundred years, till it was connected and accepted that this little spirochete that you can get from sexual contact could actually make you go crazy 30 years later. And it was just hiding in your body because, what happened? They'd get the syphilitic chancre and then it would go away. So the person they thought was fine, but they weren't treated. And it was just growing in their body, spreading to their heart, spreading to their brain. And that's why in the future, years later, these people have these symptoms. But initially it was, what are you telling me? How could it be that this infection 30 years later causes that problem? It wasn't until they were able to isolate the spirochetes in human tissue that they were able to realize that, hey, this thing really does stay around long and really does create a whole variety of symptoms.
Yeah,
and that's kind of what we're in.
Yeah.
With Lyme.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't think you'd have to repeat the whole thing over again. That's the can't we learn from previous experience, even if it took a few hundred years?
It's inconceivable, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To start from scratch. Yeah. I know we had a brief discussion, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call this a crime against humanity, is refusing to look outside the box and carry that scientific curiosity as a doctor.
Well, and what happens is, as medicine keeps evolving, also though, so does reimbursement and government controls. And so thinking out of the box is not necessarily rewarded, because you may end up costing more money to everybody. Even though the cost of having a chronic Lyme infection is, I don't know how many millions over a lifetime. But getting treatment in the first few months or first year that can prevent that is saving so much money.
Yeah, absolutely. Short-sighted.
So it's very short-sighted.
Yeah,
it's incredible. And also, when it affects our kids, like I said, kids are a work in progress, and you don't know how they change every day. Sometimes you feel like they look different every day. One day they look like their father, one day they look like their mother. But when you have a tick-borne illness, especially like Lyme or Bartonella, early in childhood, that's going to throw this kid's life totally off course if it continues to become a chronic illness. Okay, because it's going to cause, it has the potential to cause, and I say that everybody has this, can cause mood problems, cognitive problems, problems with processing information. So that a child who didn't have ADD, attention deficit disorder, will start to look like they have it. And that's because, think about it, if it takes longer for you to get the information in and then to process it and go on to the next thing, well, the teacher is not adjusting her speed to your mind. She's just doing it at her regular pace. But now you can't follow her at her regular pace. So therefore, you're going to be missing a significant amount of what's going on, and you're going to be diagnosed probably with ADD. Also, what happens is these kids have problems with working memory. Working memory is like on exams, you read a paragraph, okay? You take the important points and you hold it over here in your head. And then you go to the questions. Memory, this may not, I mean, there'll be something, but maybe only 1% of what it should be. And so, of course, you've got to take long, paragraphs. So you can see where that's going to make schoolwork much harder. You can also see issues with word finding. I have an adorable 3-year-old who asked her mother for a cookie. And she said, I want She said dark. She couldn't come up with the word for Oreo. And the teacher had called her mother and said that she was noticed in the class. The child was very precocious and 3 years old, that she couldn't find the right words to say what she meant. She could talk around it, but she couldn't find the right words. Word finding. And a 3-year-old, and the child was able to describe it to me. But if you have these difficulties, you're not going to do well in school, or you're not going to be who you could be, even if you have a great IQ. These things can really hamper you. And also with these illnesses, I mean, they affect you physically. The kids were often exhausted, so they're not participating in sports. And aside from sports being healthy, it's also where you learn social rules of give and take and what's fairness, okay? And how to be part of a group. Very important skills that actually were hampered during COVID because everybody was at home. But these are very important developmental skills for adulthood. And so you're going to be off socially, emotionally, and cognitively. That's not what we want for our children, not at all.
No, and you'd be probably in less than 1% of doctors in your specialty that would have any understanding of this. So you can imagine how many kids are going under the radar.
For sure. I mean, I talk to my colleagues and sometimes it's like I'm talking Greek. But it's, if I didn't see it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But I have, and I've seen kids get better in ways I would never have believed, improved. And so by catching Lyme and the tick-borne illnesses early, you can help save a childhood or a kid.
Yeah. As
to perhaps cause a lot of problems for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And, there are studies in adults that have looked at rates of depression and suicide in those that have suffered from Lyme disease, chronic Lyme disease. And there was a study that was done in Denmark in collaboration with, that was Michael Benros in Denmark and Brian Fallon at Columbia and a few other researchers. And they looked at individuals with Lyme disease over a 22-year period.
Wow.
And these individuals, because have excellent records in Denmark. So they looked for cases of Lyme, but they looked at hospital records, people who had contact either inpatient at the hospital, maybe they went to the outpatient clinic, or they went to a satellite or whatever. They found around 12,000 individuals. What they then did is look at the 12,000 and consider the rest of almost 7 million, the controls. And they found that there was definitely a higher rate of mental illness in those with Lyme, and especially mood disorders in individuals with Lyme. Also, those with Lyme had higher rates of suicide attempts, and that group also had a higher number of suicides. And then what they also found was the more you had Lyme, the more new episodes you had, that increased your likelihood of being depressed and making suicide attempts. It didn't increase the number of suicides, that it didn't. And when you look at this data, it's very interesting. They group their assessment by 10-year periods. So ages were 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, etc. If you looked at the group that had mood disorders, approximately 40% of the individuals were children and adolescents.
Mhm.
And then if you look for different things at different ages, the group that had the highest rate of depression was a 10 to 19-year-old group, I think, or 15 to 19-year-old group. Kids who had Lyme disease before age 10 were at heightened risk compared to everybody else of suicide attempts later in life. I find that pretty scary, and I think most people would agree that is.
Very scary.
And that's not just, because people don't believe you. There's more.
Mm.
Your inability to function kind of goes along with that.
Yeah.
But we know that suicide has increased in that 10 to 14-year-old age group throughout the whole world. We need to come up with strategies to intervene there.
Mm.
And what is interesting in that study, that was done in Europe, the predominant type of Borrelia, which is, the bacteria that causes Lyme, the predominant Borrelia is Borrelia afzelii and Guerinii. In the United States, the predominant one, and really predominant one, is Borrelia burgdorferi. Well, the one in America, burgdorferi, induces a much stronger inflammatory reaction. So going back to what we said earlier, how inflammation is the buzzword these days, I don't think it's surprising that we have a lot more of this problem in the United States than we realized, and that probably these illnesses are playing a role.
And Dr. Greenberg, you indicated that quite a high percentage of your patients don't have a history of a tick bite, a known history.
No, a very small percentage have known history of tick bites. Also, I read CDC and literature that congenital Lyme is rare. That's just not true. And I know that it's not true because in my practice alone, I have picked up, I don't know, maybe 6 or something cases where I've diagnosed the kid and then had the parent tested because I thought it was congenital, where it's been confirmed. Well, that's not rare if it's just in this little psychiatric practice in New Jersey. Granted, I do realize that the numbers that I get are skewed because I'm in a Lyme endemic area. And an important question would be, are you seeing any of these symptoms in kids who are positive for Lyme in the area, but not presenting to psychiatrists, not needing psychiatrists? But we don't have that control group at this point because it's hard enough for people to believe that kids have problems with Lyme disease. And the idea of that you can once you get the tick bite, if you just give one dose of antibiotic, that should make it go away. It's just ridiculous. That's a crime, because it can interfere with the person developing the antibodies that might show their exposure on testing. There are studies that look at like the erythema migrans rash, and if you give antibiotics, it goes away. Well, you know what? If you don't give antibiotics, it goes away. And there are just a whole bunch of things. If you go through the literature, that kind of leave you very, or at least me, very puzzled. There are, I don't know how much, your viewers are familiar with the Western blot and the different bands that occur on the testing. But two bands that were really very specific for Lyme disease, 31 and 34, were taken out in the 1990s when they were going to have a Lyme vaccine, because OspA 31 was used to make the vaccine. So you took away the most specific bands, and those don't even get reported, those two bands. And yet those bands actually go along with some neuropsychiatric issues in kids. So kids get shortchanged all over the place. Because we're still in the middle of trying to convince people it happens in adults. But it's a shame.
Yeah. And so if you're a parent concerned about your child, what do you tell parents to watch for if they're concerned about behavior or other symptoms in their children?
Well, especially if you start getting changes and you spend a lot of time outdoors, and in the brush, in the woods, that's going to put you more at risk. But on the other hand, in my neighborhood, which is a suburban neighborhood, we have deer roaming our streets and in my backyard. So you're not safe anywhere. Basically, and I have mothers tell me, look, he's never been outside their backyard. Well, that doesn't mean it's not in your backyard. Okay, but as a parent, the symptoms that the kids develop, if you see a sudden change in your child, well, ADD doesn't come, you don't wake up one morning and have ADD. So in a child who never seemed to have problems and suddenly starts having this and he can't organize his work and whatever, something's up. And could it be an infection? And depending on where you live, could it be a tick-borne issue? Or like I said, a lot of these kids develop anxiety disorder, especially separation anxiety disorder. That's manifest as school refusal. So they just don't want to go to school. And often I find when I get a case of a kid who's very resistant to going to school, that's one of their manifestations of a tick-borne illness or an infection, as you can see that in pans and pandas. But they can't sleep alone at night. They're afraid to be left alone, and they just don't want to go to school. And they may become physical and violent, but it's not necessarily because they're angry, they're just scared to pieces. And like I said, you can get everything. Sudden onset of the boy I told you about, this sudden onset of hallucinations or delusions. You don't wake up one morning that way, usually. There's a history of difficulties before that. So especially, I think it's important for teachers and school nurses to be aware if you're seeing sudden changes in a child. One of the things that should be on your radar is infection. and especially tick-borne infections. Or if you get somebody like the boy I described who had 3 psychiatric hospitalizations, he had difficulties before then, but suddenly in 1 year he gets 3 and it's hard to treat him. Well, I always say if somebody is treatment resistant, maybe you're treating the wrong thing. Okay, you need to look at that. Maybe there's something you're really missing there. So other things that might be a tip-off that something's going on is if a child fails to make the advances in height and weight, they don't grow. Because these bugs are, the bugs want the minerals and the vitamins and they're competing with you. And so the kids, they'll go to the pediatrician, like, he hasn't, grown in 2 years. Something's wrong and you need to look for what it could be.
Mhm.
I think the most important thing for a parent is just to have ticks on their radar, and know how to prevent it, know that the parents need to know how to do tick checks. And kids shouldn't go in shorts barefoot through the woods. All these things that we used to thought were wonderful parts of childhood. How about rolling in the leaves? I mean, right? Well, ticks like to hang out there. So it's actually not so good.
No, absolutely.
I mean,
And what would you say to kids? What would you say to kids?
That, these are tiny but nasty bugs, and they can make you sick. They can make you sick. They can make you have headaches, tummy aches. They can even make you sad. Or they can make you super mad and act cuckoo, which is not who you are. And you don't even understand it, but that's what you do. So it's something that you just need to be aware of. And tick checks, I think in today's world, are very important. There are some sites where they've created different songs for different ages about how to call the tick song or something like that. It's on the website. I think Live Lyme, one of the organizations, may have it on their website. But it's something that's very simple that little kids can learn, and there's this version for older kids that I think also might be very helpful. To me, one of the best philosophers was Yogi Berra, and the famous baseball player.
Yeah.
Because he said, if I didn't believe it, I wouldn't see it. And that's what the truth of these illnesses are. You have to believe that they exist. If they don't exist and they're not on your radar, you're not going to think about them and you're not going to diagnose them. But that can cost the kid a childhood as well as adulthood. And that's just not right. And why all the controversy, I still don't get it. I mean, I see different parts of it and all, but we physicians are in this business to help kids get better. And I think most of us don't think of it as a business, actually. So, I just think that people need to be more aware that these things that are the size of a poppy seed can ruin your life in so many ways.
And treatment protocols sounds multidisciplinary. So you need to partner,
Right.
And you've mentioned, antipsychotics and other psychiatric meds and antibiotics. Is there a general, or is it pretty individualized?
It's very individualized. And I think this is part of the problem. If people could accept that, yes, this illness is real, it exists, and it may be different in different people, but maybe we can do some really good studies to find out what are the best treatments for most people, or what are the things that only work for some people. But it has not as yet been really standardized, so we don't know. So it's kind of like everybody's, trying in their own way. That's not good medicine. But it's better than nothing. People do not realize the profound effects this can have on a child. In adults, if you get a real personality change, everybody will notice. Steve came to work every day and suddenly he's lazy, he's not doing anything, and he's this and that and this. You notice. But kids are funny, They can be moody, they can have a hard time focusing, they didn't sleep last night, they're hungry, they're getting a cold. The kids are more complicated in ways. But if the medical profession doesn't really start paying attention, I think we're causing future generations real problems. There was one study that looked and found that throughout the world, 1 in 7 individuals has evidence of exposure to Lyme on blood testing.
Wow.
Now, that's not saying that they all have Lyme disease, although one of my colleagues said to me, well, you don't know what they're like in 20 years from now. Okay. But we're not ready to take such leaps right now. But that's in a lot of places. And individuals with tick-borne illness can also be aggressive. And that's what I find in my little kids. These sweet, wonderful kids suddenly become obnoxious. And you hear curses that you wouldn't believe 6-year-olds know. Or putting a hole in the wall, or throwing things. And these sweet kids never did anything like that before. But that's what these bugs can do. And we have to be able to acknowledge it, to be able to study it, and to come up with how to treat it and how to prevent it even more. Because everybody talks about prevention. Okay, but what about all these people that have it?
Yeah.
Prevention's very nice. But in the US, there are 476,000 new cases each year. And if 25% of the cases occur in individuals that are under 19, that's 119,000 new cases each year. It's a lot. That's a lot of childhoods being affected or potentially being affected. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, but it has to be recognized, it has to be accepted. And that's the struggle right now, especially women with congenital Lyme, rare, as I told you. And, you can transmit the spirochete through breast milk. So I wouldn't be comfortable saying, oh, the mom's on an antibiotic so she could breastfeed. I think so.
It's a real hard decision, that one, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. If you know that you can transmit it, if you have, you have it, and there's a risk of transmission, that's on my list of no-brainers personally. There may be a lot of benefits from having breast milk, but getting spirochetes is definitely in the negative column. But there's so much more we have to know. But until money is spent funding researchers who are not doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same answer, we're stuck. And things have really got to change.
And so families in Australia, we had a brief discussion. They basically can't get medical care now here for any tick-borne diseases. Is there any kind of natural protocols or anything that they don't need a doctor for that could assist a situation? So,
Well, there are naturopaths and individuals that use a lot of more homeopathic and naturopathic types of herbs and different plants and things. If you can find somebody who has antibiotics aren't for everybody. Things to make sure you're going, which are the increase in the symptom that you're treating the person for.
the
I don't know
internet
what
went
happened.
funny. Yeah, I think we lost you after. I don't know if it's your internet or my internet. It's most likely mine. There's weird things happening in Australia, but we lost you right when you're talking about herbs and naturopaths and
Treating herbs, so you can get right the Irish Herxheimer, the Herxheimer reactions, which are when you kill the bacteria, toxins may be released, or even the fragments that cause an immunologic reaction. But you can person can get very sick, and they have an exacerbation of the symptoms that they're getting treated for. Well, so if you're treating someone for a hot knee, a swollen, red, hot, painful knee, that can get worse in a Herxheimer reaction, be it with antibiotics or with certain herbs. Well, what do you think happens if you have a kid who has a hot temper and you treat them with antibiotics or herbs? Your Herxheimer can be a kid who needs to be hospitalized because they're so out of control. And I've seen that can happen. The point is to be aware of the risks that are going on and to work with people who know then, okay, that's important. Then you've got to back down and approach this in a different way or more slowly, whatever. But there are, these more naturopathic options. And for some people, they're great. I know people wind up leaving the country and going to other countries, but most people don't have that amount of money. And that's not fair. It's not. And especially because it's an illness that once it's chronic is hard to treat. And you don't know how long you're going to have to treat it for. So it creates so many hardships on a family.
I'm sure they're nodding their heads right now.
Well, because they need help. They deserve help.
Healthcare is a human right, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Dr. Greenberg, what would you like to leave kids and their families with today? I guess one of the hopes is that we'll keep fighting for you here at the Lyme Disease Association, and that you can get expertise overseas. And there's a few brave doctors still in Australia helping families. But what would you like to leave people with today, Dr. Greenberg?
Don't settle. Don't accept. Okay. If you're going to look, nobody knows a kid as well as their mother. If a mom thinks something's wrong. It may not be what she thinks it is. Okay. She may misinterpret what it's about. But if a mom tells you something is off, trust her. You ladies and gentlemen, you guys know that. You know your kid. when he looks a little funny, that something's off.
Mm.
You can't let a doctor just talk you into, you're wrong. What do you know? And you're the parent. You're the child's advocate. And if you believe in your heart and in your mind that something is really wrong, then you've got to keep fighting. Because often these kids will see like multiple doctors till, I wind up seeing them, or they get to other Lyme literate doctors. But and there is hope. I've seen these kids get better and thrive, but it's a rough road. And that's why I believe in education so strongly.
Yeah.
Because people need to know they're not alone in this struggle, in this battle.
And I think people listening to this now and into the future will hear that from you, Dr. Greenberg, that they aren't alone, and there are people still, even though the situation is dire and wrong and a crime, we're still pushing for it. And make sure you connect with other Lyme patients and Lyme families. There's a lot of knowledge once you've been fighting this battle, and you need to walk hand in hand in this kind of journey. So Dr. Greenberg, God bless you. Thank you for what you're doing. I know you would have faced your own battles in your profession, and we're grateful that you're persisting.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And good luck, everybody.
Thank you.